Greetings and hello again. It is Dr. Wood talking about levels of literature. This will be a quick video, but it's something I think is important to make sure you guys have a good understanding of. When we talk about different levels of literature, we're kind of referring to not necessarily strength of evidence, but we're more talking about the sources of the literature itself. So you may hear me talk about things like primary, secondary, and tertiary literature. And so if you're not familiar with that, basically when we say primary literature, this is going to be original research that is done. So for instance, if you ran a randomized controlled trial, or if you did a cohort study or a case control study, and reported those results, say in a journal or a poster presentation at a conference, anything like that, that is considered to be primary literature. That is usually where people will take that information and then incorporate it into some of their own work, right? So this is kind of the basis for all research. It is the primary source, right? So very important from that standpoint. If you don't have any primary literature, you can't form any secondary or tertiary literature because that's where all the information comes from, essentially, right? Keep in mind, you can also see things like actual bench research is considered primary literature. Really anything where the actual data is being collected and reported for the first time generally is going to be considered primary literature. Secondary literature is actually what you're doing for your research papers. You're actually summarizing and putting together a piece of information based off of the primary literature. Now, you may use things like tertiary literature, which I'll talk about in a moment, to provide background, say for instance for the introduction and the discussion for your papers, but in general most of the arguments you're going to be making one way or the other is going to be based off of the primary literature. So you're pulling disparate pieces of information together, different studies, and then basically comparing, contrasting, and coming up with a conclusion. So again, any kind of literature review articles you're going to find out there. If you look at a systematic review, even a meta-analysis could be kind of considered a secondary piece of literature. Anything like that is considered secondary. And then finally, we have tertiary literature. This is typically once information is sort of codified, when it is sort of accepted as truth, so to speak. Again, I say that with major air quotes there, which I know you can see me now, which I didn't actually do the air quotes, so just pretend I did that. But tertiary literature is basically going to be things like your textbooks. This is going to be things like encyclopedias, anything like that. I suppose you could even say something like Wikipedia might be a piece of tertiary literature. But basically, they are going to be the kind of the bedrock for things in terms of information. So if you need to describe the pathophysiology of diabetes, you would probably use a tertiary literature source, right? I can find a million different textbooks that talk about the pathophysiology. Again, they are writing their work based off of primary and secondary literature. But once you have a textbook, that's pretty well standardized, pretty well set. Okay, this is kind of the way things are, at least for the time being, right? Keep in mind things like up-to-date are probably more likely to be considered secondary literature because generally those are going to be subject experts who are pulling together different pieces of information, things like guidelines, things like review articles and primary literature, and sort of summarizing and discussing a certain topic. So I'd probably consider it more secondary literature from that standpoint there. So anyway, again, a brief video, but I want you to understand the difference between a piece of primary, secondary, and tertiary literature. Remember, for your reference list, I want you to have at least 5 pieces that are going to be that primary literature. Again, I want that within the past 5 years because that is original research, that's new material, that is stuff that you're going to actually get into the meat and potatoes of it when actually trying to come up with an answer for your question. Okay. Anyway, that's it. If you have any questions, feel free to let me know, and I'll see you next time. Thanks a lot.